The first time Marion Tolliver ever called my house, it wasn't to ask about his daughter. It was to ask if I could come pull a dead pump out of a 200-foot well at 11 o'clock at night in the middle of an ice storm, because his neighbor's cattle had no water, and the neighbor was too proud to ask anybody himself. 31 years later, that same family stood around me in a half circle in a rented house on the Alabama coast and waited for me to say I was sorry. I didn't. That's the whole story, friend, and I'm going to tell it to you straight. If you're new here, pull up a chair. Tell me down in the comments where you're watching from. I read every one of them, and it does me good to know who's out there. And if you've ever been the outsider in somebody else's family, stay with me, because I think you already know how the first half of this goes. You might not know how it ends. I have to start with Marion, because without Marion, none of the rest of it means anything. Marion Tolliver was 90 years old that September. He'd spent 38 years as a lineman for the Rural Electric Cooperative, and he had the hands to prove it, knuckles like walnuts, a thumbnail that never grew back right after a transformer cover came down on it in 1974. He kept 9 hives of bees on a strip of bottomland he owned outside Bloomsdale, Missouri. And every fall he'd bottle honey in whatever jars people brought him, and hand them back full, no charge, and get insulted if you tried to pay him. He still climbed a stepladder to clean his own gutters at 89, which nearly gave his daughters a stroke. And when I told him he ought to quit doing that, he said a man who hires out his own gutters has started dying and just hasn't been informed. He was the only person in my wife's family who ever asked me a real question and then shut up long enough to hear the answer. When our daughter Shelby was born, we didn't have insurance worth the paper. Marion showed up at the hospital in state. Genevieve at 6 in the morning with 2 cups of coffee and a paper sack of gas station donuts, and he sat in that waiting room for 4 hours and never once mentioned that he'd driven in from a night shift. He just handed me a coffee without asking if I wanted one. He knew I did. My name's Everett Calloway. Folks call me Ev. I was 66 that year. I drilled water wells for 41 years, all over southeast Missouri and up into Illinois. And I retired at 64 with a bad shoulder and a good reputation, which in my line of work is about the best trade you can make. I'd been married to Loretta Tolliver for 38 years. Now, I'm going to tell you my flaw right up front, because I don't want you thinking I'm handing you a story where I'm the hero from the first minute. My flaw is that I let things ride. Somebody says something with a hook in it, and I let it go by, and I tell myself I'm keeping the peace. I did that for 3 decades with Loretta's family. I want to say this now, before we get into it. Swallowing something doesn't make it go away. It just changes where it comes back up, and when. Loretta's older sister is Bernadette. Everybody's called her Birdie since she was 6, which has always struck me as the wrong name for her. Birdie ran a title company in town for 26 years and retired with money and the firm conviction that organizing people is the same thing as loving them. She ran every family event we ever had. Laminated schedules, assigned bedrooms, a printed seating chart for a fish fry in a garage. Birdie never disliked me loudly. That's important. She was the cold kind that never raises its voice. She'd ask about my work in a tone that made drilling wells sound like a hobby I'd taken up to fill the time. She once told a room full of people, with me standing in it, that Loretta had married practical. She said it like a compliment. She smiled when she said it. That's the flavor of it. If you've got somebody like that in your life, you can't even point at it. There's nothing to hold up. Her son Dalton was 44, a financial advisor in Chesterfield, the kind of fellow who says, at the end of the day, 3 times in one sentence. His boy Preston was 14. Now here's the part I didn't understand the weight of until much later. That September, Birdie decided Marion's 90th birthday needed to be a week, not an afternoon. She rented a big house down in Gulf Shores, Alabama, right on the water, 6 bedrooms, a pool, the whole business, and she booked it. And she booked the flights for all 23 of us out of street, Louis into Pensacola, and she put everything on her card and had everybody pay her back. Which sounds generous, and I want to be fair, it partly was. Birdie liked doing it. She also liked that every single person in that house was there on her arrangements, sleeping in a room she'd assigned, on a return flight she was holding. Our granddaughter Junie came with us. She was 8. Shelby had taken a travel nursing contract out in Phoenix that fall, and her husband Cole was on a rig, so Junie and her little brother Emmett had been staying with us since August. Emmett had an ear infection that week and stayed home with Cole's mother, so it was just Junie. She'd never seen the ocean. She'd been counting down on a paper chain taped to our refrigerator since the first of the month. Junie is a builder. That's the thing about her. She's 8 going on 40. She's got a stubby little pencil behind her ear at all times like she's estimating a job. And all summer she and I had been working on a present for Marion out in my shop. A bee-box. A real one, a 10-frame deep, cut from cedar I had left over from a porch job. With box joints, she cut herself on my table saw with me standing behind her with my hands over hers. She sanded it 4 separate evenings. She burned a little bee into the side with a wood-burning pen and got the wings crooked and cried about it. And I told her the crooked ones, how he'll know it was you. She wrapped it in newspaper because she said wrapping paper was a waste of a tree. We drove that box down in a suitcase. She held it on her lap through security. The day before the birthday supper, Friday, September 19th, Marion asked me to run him somewhere. He'd flown down with Bertie's crew, but he'd made his own arrangement. And what he asked me was, would I take him to a notary in Foley, about 20 minutes inland, at 10:30 in the morning. He said he had some paperwork he'd been meaning to get squared away, and he didn't want to make a production out of it. Now I want you to notice something, because a lot of folks in my situation would have said sure and then let it slide. I didn't let it slide. I got him in the rental at 10:15. I drove him over there. I sat in that parking lot with the windows down and the radio off for about 40 minutes while he was inside with 2 other people I didn't know. When he came out, he had a manila envelope, sealed, and he handed it to me across the console and said, "Put that somewhere it won't get bent, and don't open it till somebody tells you to." I said, "Marion, what is this?" He said, "It's mine till it isn't, then it's a nuisance for somebody else." And he laughed at his own joke and asked if we could stop for a butterscotch milkshake, and we did, and that was that. I put the envelope in the zipper pocket of my duffel bag under 2 clean shirts, and I forgot about it inside of an hour. 10:40 in the morning on Friday, September 19th. Hold on to that time, friend. It matters more than anything else that happened that whole week, and not one person in that beach house knew it had happened at all. Saturday, September 20th. The supper started at 5:30. Bertie had it catered. Shrimp, gumbo, a cake with a photograph of Marion at 22, printed on it in frosting. Everybody in linen. Everybody in their assigned chair. Around 6:15, Junie carried her newspaper-wrapped box up to the gift table. The gift table had been arranged. Of course it had. There was a wooden box of bourbon from Dalton and a framed thing, and a couple of envelopes standing up on little easels. Junie set her present down in the middle, and Bertie came along maybe 2 minutes later and moved it. Not roughly. She just picked it up and set it on the floor behind the table leg, the way you'd move a paint can out of a doorway, and slid the bourbon over into the gap. I saw it. I let it ride. There it is again, 38 years of practice. Then, about 6:15, Dalton was pouring for people, and he looked over at that newspaper bundle on the floor and said, loud, in the way a man says a thing when he wants the whole room to have it, "Some folks bring a check. Some folks bring firewood." He got his laugh. 4 or 5 people. Not everybody, but enough. And Preston, 14 years old, standing right there with a Coke, said to Junie, "Is that from the dollar store, or did you make it in class?" And Junie said, "I made it." And Preston said, "Yeah, you can tell." I was out on the deck at that moment, running a wrench on the outdoor shower head because it had been dripping since Tuesday, and nobody had looked at it, and I don't know how to sit in a house with a thing dripping in it. So I got the story about 20 seconds late, when Junie came out the sliding door and found me. She didn't cry, friend. I want you to understand that. She has never once been a crier. She stood there with her hands behind her back, and she waited till I'd set the wrench down, and then she asked me, real quiet, in a voice I hadn't heard her use before, "Grandpa, is homemade the same as cheap?" I have thought about that sentence more than any other sentence anybody has ever said to me. It wasn't Preston's smart mouth that did it. Boys of 14 say ignorant things. I said plenty. It was that an 8-year-old girl who had sanded a piece of cedar 4 evenings in a row because she wanted to get it right had just been taught something, in one afternoon, by grown adults, that would have taken her 40 years to unlearn. I said no. I said homemade is what a thing costs when you pay for it with your own time instead of somebody else's. I said Marion is going to keep bees in that box for the rest of his life. And she nodded like she was accepting a deposition, and she went and sat on the bottom step of the deck stairs with her chin on her knees, and that was when I went inside. I want to be honest with you about how I handled it, because I didn't handle it perfect. I found Dalton by the kitchen island, and I said, level, not loud, that his son owed my granddaughter an apology, and that he owed one to a 90-year-old man for calling his birthday present firewood. Bertie was closer than I'd realized. She came around the island and she said, Everett, he's 14. It was a joke. Don't make a scene at my father's party, I said. It wasn't a joke to her. And Dalton, and I'll remember this a long time, Dalton laughed through his nose and said, you're a little tender for a man your size. I said something back. I told him a man who's never once fixed anything in his life ought to be careful running his mouth about the people who do. Not my finest hour of statesmanship. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. And inside of about 90 seconds, that entire house had stopped talking to each other and started watching me. Now here's the part I keep coming back to, friend. 23 people, aunts, cousins, in-laws, people I'd hauled furniture for, people whose sump pumps I'd fixed at midnight for free. 23 people in that room, and not one of them said, actually, that wasn't all right to say to a little girl. Not one. They looked at me like I was the thing that had gone wrong. That's the loneliest arithmetic there is. You can survive somebody being cruel to your grandbaby. What gets in under the ribs is the 22 people who watched it happen and decided the problem was the man who objected. Loretta took me out onto the side porch by the propane grill. I want to be fair to my wife here, because she was not cruel about it, and because she's been my wife for 38 years, and I'd be a liar if I painted her as a villain. She was scared. She had that particular fear a woman gets when she's spent 64 years managing her older sister's weather. Her hands were shaking a little. She said, you embarrassed me in front of everybody. I said, Junie got embarrassed first. She said, you've got 2 roads here, Ev. You go in there and tell Bertie and Dalton you're sorry, or you can go on home. She said it flat, not shouting. Somehow flat made it land about 4 times harder than shouting would have. I looked at her. There was a clock over the stove inside. One of those cheap rental house clocks with a second hand you could hear through the screen door, and I counted it without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then I said, all right, I'll go. I've heard people say a moment like that feels like a bomb going off. It doesn't. It's the quietest thing that's ever happened to you. The screen door didn't even slam. It's got one of those pneumatic closers on it. It just sighed shut behind me, and that was somehow worse. Here's what I did next, and it's the thing I'd want you to hold on to if you take nothing else from this. I went and got Junie off that step, and I crouched down in front of her and I said, you want to stay for the cake, or you want to go home? She said, is Grandma coming? I said, not tonight. She thought about it about as long as I'd thought about my answer to Loretta. Then she said, I want to go home. So I zipped up her little cardigan and I got our 2 bags out of the assigned bedroom, and we walked out the front door of that house through the gravel, holding hands. At 7:20 in the evening, and that was the loudest thing I did all week. I didn't leave that child in a house full of people who just taught her she was cheap. I want to say that plain, because I've heard stories where a man walks out and leaves his kid behind, and I never could make sense of it. Whatever else I got wrong that weekend, and I got some things wrong, I did not get that wrong. Loretta was standing in the front room when we went through. She didn't say anything, but she picked Junie's jacket up off the arm of the chair and handed it to me, and she squeezed my wrist for about half a second when she did it. Bertie saw her do it. I watched Bertie see it. 2 other things happened before we got out of that driveway. The first, Loretta's cousin Verna, 61 years old, retired lunch lady, the person in that family, least likely to be on anybody's radar, came out the side door with a paper plate wrapped in foil, shrimp, and gumbo, and 2 pieces of cornbread, and she put it in my hands without asking if I wanted it. Same way Marion used to hand me coffee. She said, "You did right by that baby." That's it. That's all she said. She didn't make a speech, and she didn't stand out there and take a side in front of anybody. She went right back in through that side door before her cousin Bertie could see she'd been gone. Friend, if you've ever been the one person who came out the side door with a plate, I want you to know that it counts. It counted for me for the rest of my life. The second thing, Marion. He came out onto the front step. 90 years old, in a short-sleeved dress shirt, with his good ear turned toward us. He didn't say a word. I raised a hand to him. He didn't wave back. He just nodded. One time, slow, like a man filing something away in a drawer he already had built. I thought about that nod for a long while afterward. Now Bertie had the return flights. I want to be real specific about this, because it's the piece people ask about. All 23 of us were booked on her reservation out of Pensacola into St. Louis on the following Wednesday. We hadn't driven. It's about 11 hours from state. Genevieve down to Gulf Shores, and Bertie had decided months back that nobody was doing that with children. My truck was sitting in my own driveway in Missouri where it belonged. I texted her from the rental car in the driveway because I'm 66 and I still believe in telling people things, and I said we were heading home early and asked her to move Junie's seat and mine up. She wrote back 4 minutes later, "Those seats were a favor. You've made it clear you don't want favors from this family. Figure it out." So I drove that rental to Pensacola International, and Junie fell asleep in the back with her forehead against the window, and I sat in the short-term garage on the 3rd level for about 40 minutes, with the engine off and my hands on my knees. I wasn't stewing. I want to be truthful about that. I was doing arithmetic on my phone. And then I bought 2 one-way tickets. Pensacola to St. Louis, 6:50 a.m. Sunday, $491 for the pair. And I got us a room by the airport. And I texted my wife one line, "We're going home. Take your time." We flew out at dawn. Junie got the window. She'd never been on a plane before that week, and she still thought it was the best thing that had ever happened to her. And about 10 minutes after takeoff, she said, "Grandpa, we're above the whole ocean." And I said we sure were. And what neither one of us knew, what my wife didn't know, what Bertie for certain didn't know, was that the thing Bertie had been counting on for 30 years had quit being true at 10:40 in the morning, on Friday, in a notary's office in Foley, Alabama, while I sat in the parking lot with the radio off. The calls started Monday. Loretta called 9 times Monday. By Tuesday night, it was 22. By Thursday, it was 41, and that's counting Bertie, who had never once called my phone directly in 38 years of marriage, and who called 11 times that week and left 3 voicemails I didn't listen to for 2 months. I didn't answer, and it wasn't spite. I want to be honest with you. I didn't answer because I didn't know what I'd say yet, and I've learned the hard way that a man who talks before he knows what he thinks just makes more work for himself later. Loretta came home Thursday, not Wednesday on the group flight, Thursday, on a seat she bought herself, which cost her $380 and cost her something else besides. I found out what, eventually, what she'd said to her sister Wednesday morning in that kitchen, in front of about 9 people, was, "You moved an 8-year-old's present onto the floor, Bertie. I watched you do it, and I didn't say anything, and I've been not saying anything for 50 years. She didn't tell me that. Verna told me, at Christmas, laughing so hard she had to set her coffee down. Loretta and I had about 4 bad weeks that fall. I'm not going to sell you a story where the wife comes home and everything's fine by Sunday. We had it out at the kitchen table more than once. She told me I'd humiliated her. I told her she'd offered me 2 roads and only one of them had my granddaughter on it," she cried. "I did too, at one point, which I'm not embarrassed about at 66. But something had come loose in her down in that beach house, and it never went back where it had been. That duffel bag sat in the closet in the spare room until Halloween before I got around to unpacking the last of it. The envelope was still down under the 2 clean shirts, still sealed, and I picked it up and looked at it, and I remembered him saying, 'Don't open it till somebody tells you to,' and I thought, well, that's Marion, and I put it in the drawer of my desk under the checkbook. I want you to understand. I had no idea. If I'd known, I'd have told you. I'm not building it up on you. Marion died on February 8th. In his own bed. In his own house on Merchant Street. With the space heater running and a cup of coffee gone cold on the nightstand. 90 years old and 4 months. His heart just finished. I went to the funeral. I sat in the fourth pew from the back. Bertie did not look at me one time, which took some doing, since she stood at the front of that church for 40 minutes shaking hands. Loretta sat beside me and held my hand the whole service, in front of everybody, and did not let go of it once. And I understood, sitting there, that something had actually changed in my wife, and not just softened for the occasion. It wasn't forgiveness for her family. It was that she'd finally looked at them square, at 64 years old, without the filter she'd been issued at birth. 9 days later, on February 17th, my phone rang at 9 in the morning, and it was a woman named Adelaide Pruitt, of Pruitt and Vogel, on 3rd Street, in State Genevieve. She said, "Mr. Calloway, I represent the estate of Marion Tolliver. You're named as trustee. I need you present at the reading on March 3rd, and I need to walk you through your fiduciary obligations before that, because they start now, not then." I said, "Ma'am, I think you've got the wrong Calloway." She said, "I don't. Do you still have the envelope?" I sat down on the arm of my own couch. Here's a thing folks get wrong about this stuff, and I got it wrong too until that morning. A trustee doesn't get found out about at the reading like it's a card trick. The lawyer notifies you directly, ahead of time, because the minute that man died, you started having legal duties toward property that wasn't yours. The family doesn't get a say in whether you're told. Adelaide Pruitt told me that in about that many words, and then she said one more thing. Mr. Tolliver executed the amendment on September 19th in Baldwin County, Alabama. He'd had 2 separate competency evaluations, one in July and one in August, with Dr. Rennick. He insisted on both. He also insisted on video of the signing. He was, and I'm quoting him, "not going to leave anybody room to say I was confused." I asked her why he'd done it down there, in the middle of a birthday week, in a strange notary's office in a town he'd never been to. She said, "Because he wanted you to drive him, and he wanted to know whether you would." That envelope in my desk drawer was a certified copy of the amendment, a letter to me in his handwriting, and the name and number of the woman on the phone. March 3rd. A conference room over a shoe repair on 3rd Street, 11 o'clock in the morning. I walked in the door at 10:55 with Loretta beside me. I want to tell you what that room did. Bertie was already seated at the head of the table because of course she was. Dalton was there. Glenn was there. 2 of Marion's nieces. And every single face turned when that door opened. And you could watch the arithmetic happen behind Bertie's eyes. Why is he here? Who let him in? This is a mistake. And then Adelaide Pruitt said, "Mr. Calloway, take the seat to my right, please. You'll need to sign several things today." And Bertie went the color of a dinner plate. The reading took 20 minutes. Here's what it said. The Tolliver Feed and Seed building on Merchant Street, 2 stories. Brick, who been in that family since 1951, rented to a hardware outfit for the last 9 years, plus the 74 acres of bottomland out toward Bloomsdale with the hunting lease on it, plus the bee equipment, and the 68F, 100 inches the shed, appraised together at $815,000. None of it went to Bertie, who had assumed for 30 years that it was hers and had said so out loud at more than one Thanksgiving. None of it was divided evenly among the grandchildren, which is what everybody else in that room had figured on. It went into a trust. The beneficiaries named were June Elise Calloway, age 8, and Emmett Ray Calloway, age 5. My grandbabies, his great-grandchildren, to be managed until each of them turns 25. And one line, about 2/3 of the way down the page, said that Everett Calloway was to serve as trustee until that time. Dalton, the man who'd told me I was tender for my size, found out in that room that I was now the one who decided when his boy Preston could hunt that bottomland again. And Bertie found out something else in that room, which I think might have been the part that actually broke through. Her cousin Verna had known about the amendment since October. Marion had told her. Verna, the lunch lady, the nobody, the one who came out the side door with a plate of shrimp. She'd sat through Christmas dinner at Bertie's table, and never said one word. Bertie said, and I heard this myself. I was 6 feet away. He wasn't in his right mind. He was 90 years old, and he was confused, and somebody got in his ear. And Adelaide Pruitt, who had sat with that man through 2 competency evaluations, who had a doctor's letter and a video file with a timestamp on it, folded her hands on the table and said, "Mrs. Shaw, I'd advise you to be careful. That's a claim you'd have to bring, and I don't believe you want to see what I'd put in front of a judge." Nobody in that room believed Bertie. That's the thing. Her own son wouldn't look at her. And I've thought since then that losing the building didn't hurt her half as bad as looking around that table and seeing that not one person there thought she was telling the truth. Now, I know some of you are waiting for the scene where I walked up to Bertie in a parking lot and told her exactly what I thought of her. There isn't one. I'm sorry. I'd be lying if I gave you one. What there was instead was a phone call in July, 4 months later. Bertie called and asked, very pleasantly, like nothing had ever happened in her whole life, whether Dalton might lease the feed and seed building. He had a notion about opening a satellite office there. She said she assumed there'd be a family rate. My voice never came up. It didn't need to. I told her the building was already leased 9-year tenant, and past that, I'd signed a letter of intent with 2 young women from Bloomsdale who wanted to put in a bakery and a coffee counter downstairs. One of them is Verna's granddaughter. I told her the bottomland lease runs through 2032. I told her Junie handles who comes out to see the bees, and that Junie would let her cousins know if there was an opening. There wasn't going to be an opening. She understood that without me spelling it out for her. That's the way it works with people like Bertie. They've spent their whole life speaking in that language. You don't have to translate. She hasn't apologized. I want to be truthful with you about that too. I'm told she still says, at what's left of the family gatherings, that I turned a confused old man against his own daughter. I used to think I'd need her to see it different before I could be settled about it. That's the part that surprised me most, friend. I don't need that anymore. It went away on its own, somewhere in the 2nd year, the way a sore shoulder finally quits. Loretta and I are still married. It's the 40th year coming up. We talk now about things we used to let go by, and I'll tell you honestly that some weeks that's harder work than the quiet ever was. But it's true, and I'll take true. Preston wrote me last April, 16 by then. The text said, "Is Junie still mad at me?" I said, "Probably some." He said, "Can I learn the bees?" I said, "Come Saturday, wear boots, and don't wear black." He's been out 4 times. He's not bad at it. He apologized to Junie in my kitchen without me making him do it, which I think means it took. I'm not going to hold what a boy said at 14 against a man at 30. That'd make me the thing I walked out of that house about. Junie's 11 now. Last month, she and I set that cedar box out on the bottomland, the one with the crooked bee burned into the side, the one that got moved onto the floor behind a table leg. It's got a live colony in it. Marion had it out at his place for 4 years, and it made honey the whole time. She asked me, while we were getting the smoker going, why her great-grandpa left it all to her and Emmett instead of to Aunt Bertie. I told her the truth. I said, Marion left what he had to the people who kept showing up. And I said showing up isn't one big thing you do while everybody's watching. It's a small decision you make over and over on days when nobody's keeping score. It's a dead pump in an ice storm. It's a cup of coffee handed to a man who never asked for one. It's a paper plate out a side door. It's a 20-minute drive to a notary in Foley, Alabama, when you'd rather be at the beach. He didn't leave it to me. I want to be clear on that, because I know how it sounds. He left it to 2 children he barely got to know, and he made me carry it, which is a different thing entirely, and a fair bit more work. If there's one thing I'd want you to take home from this, it's this. A boundary is not the same thing as meanness, no matter how loud the people on the other side of it insist that it is. And what you're worth is not a thing anybody else gets to hand down to you, no matter how many chairs they've set out or whose name is on the seating chart. If this story puts you in mind of your own family or your own table, I'd like to hear about it. Has your family ever mistaken your quiet for agreement? Tell me down in the comments where you're watching from and what happened, and I'll read it. Give it a like if you believe showing up is worth more than an apology. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one. I'll see you then, friend. Take care of yourself.